This is Edward Downs, quizmaster for Texaco's Opera Quiz. As a former music critic myself, I'm especially delighted to have four of my former colleagues on our panel this afternoon. They are Albert Goldberg, music critic of the Los Angeles Times, Irving Kolodin, associate editor of the Saturday Review and head of that magazine's music review department, Alfred Frankenstein, who is music and art critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, and Jay Harrison, for many years music editor of the New York Herald Tribune, and now a director of Reader's Digest Music Incorporated. Welcome to the quiz, gentlemen. And this is our first question, which comes to us from Miss Victoria Danford of Montreal, Quebec, Canada. A very straightforward answer to this might make life pleasanter for you in some cases, gentlemen. This is Miss Danford's question. What question do you, as a music critic, most dislike or resent being asked? Mr. Goldberg.
I think probably the most objectionable pest is the party who says, I read what you wrote, but what do you really think?
Mr. Kolodin.
Yeah, that's a two-edged sword, because it implies in the first instance that you haven't said what you really think, or else that you haven't said it in a way that makes any sense.
You weren't understandable even
right.
in what you wrote. Mr. Frankenstein.
Even more of a pest in some ways is the one who says, what did you think I didn't read what you wrote?
Not so flattering. Mr. Harrison.
And the devastating one is the person who says to you, what makes you think you know it all?
And what do you say to that?
2 days later, you think of the answer.
Well, now, here's a question that's not unrelated to that. This one comes from Joseph Guzzetti, Jr. of New York City. And he asks whether you do much homework before you go to hearing a work that you've never heard before. Or do you prefer, possibly, to go completely ignorant and get your fresh first impression? Mr. Kolodin?
Well, I would say that the more familiar the composer is, the more homework that's desirable.
Why is that? That's interesting.
Well, you hear an unfamiliar work by a well-known composer, and you would like to know exactly what the text is, as it's against any deviations or editorial alterations or things of that sort.
I see what you mean, yes.
Whereas with an unknown work, it's desirable to know something, but not absolutely imperative.
Not so necessary to be familiar with the very letter of every detail. Yes, well, Mr. Harrison.
Well, I don't quite agree with Mr. Kolodin in that sense. I think it's necessary to do homework in any case, because you take a terrible flyer when you hear a piece once and then you run back to an office. If it's possible, and it's not always possible, to get the score or attend a rehearsal, I think it's eminently desirable. It cuts your risk as in writing the review down to a minimum.
Yes, and even one's memory. Mr. Kolodin.
Well, as against that, in the case of what Mr. Harrison was saying, that in an unfamiliar work, I agree to that extent, but also, perhaps if you know too much about what it's supposed to be, you're not quite as keenly aware of what it is.
Yes, that very often can happen. Mr. Goldberg.
I think it's helpful to know the historical background, perhaps, and the circumstances of composition. And in the case of a new work, if a score is available, I like to take it to the concert, but I prefer to form an opinion on oral impressions, on the first impression of hearing a work.
Mm-hmm. I do much. I hate to follow a score when I hear something the first time, because I don't hear it in actual... Mr. Frankenstein.
It's my privilege to write the program notes for the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. And I know that every time I hear a new work which I have annotated previously, I understand it far better than when I come to it cold. However, it's very frequently not possible to get a hold of a score. Often one must go cold. And here I would like, in this particular case, to solicit the help of performers. Very often I have asked performers if they would permit me to attend rehearsals. Almost invariably they say no. Almost invariably they are afraid that I'm coming to spy out an inadequate performance, which is not what I'm interested in the slightest.
Yes. Well, it's not easy to be perfectly prepared for all these things. Here's a question about something that's happened to all of us a good many times. Miss Jan Perry of Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, wants to know how you feel, or what your reaction is, when you find that an opera performance you described in your review as being just wonderful has been roasted to a cinder by your colleagues. How do you feel about that, Mr. Frankenstein?
I couldn't care less.
Meaning that you feel you are right and they're wrong?
Not necessarily. Meaning that there are many, many shades of opinion, and perhaps we're both right.
That's a very relativistic Mr. Goldberg.
Well, I can't maintain Mr. Frankenstein's Olympian aloofness. If somebody disagrees with me drastically, I first get rather wrought up, and I think, well, what an idiot this is. If somebody has agreed with me, I sort of pass it off. But if they've disagreed, I'm inclined to reread their review a second time and think, well, maybe there's a point here. Maybe I was wrong.
Well, it can be disconcerting. Mr. Kolodin.
I would say it depends on who disagrees with who.
Mr. Harris.
I always used to feel enormous sympathy with anyone who didn't agree with me. I'd always say, the poor fellow,
Poor
you
fellow.
know, what does he know?
Appreciate that. Well, now that we've settled your opinions of your colleagues, gentlemen, how about yourselves? Mr. Leo Taub of New York City wants each of you to recall, if you can, one statement of your own that you somewhat wince to think back to, something you wish you had never said in print. And then, if you can, tell us what made you say such a thing in the first place. Who is first in the confessional? Mr. Collup.
Well, I can think of various things I've said which I don't even want to quote. But if I knew why I'd said them, I wouldn't say it again, but I'm sure I will.
Oh, you probably avoid making the error a second time, I'm sure. Mr. Goldberg.
Well, I think it's healthy for a critic to lose his temper once in a while. And I'm not inclined to regret things I say under such conditions. What I bitterly regret, and which always chagrins and embarrasses me, is a misstatement of fact, a factual error. I think that's unforgivable, but sometimes it happens.
It must happen to all of us sometime or other. Mr. Harrison?
I'd like to switch the question around, and I think my colleagues will agree. The thing that I really wince at is reading a review and discovering the things I forgot to say.
Yes.
In writing it in haste, the next morning you look at your review and say, good grief, I left out a terribly important point, and that really is wince-making. Much more
something
so
you
than
specially wanted to say as you were listening to it, Mr. Frankenstein.
I think the thing that I wince most to think about, something I wrote very many years ago when I was very young in the business, quoting Tchaikovsky's extremely unfavorable opinion of Brahms's violin concerto. I quoted it because it seemed to me, being very young and very new in the business, that quite possibly a composer's opinion of another composer's work might have a certain authority and validity. I have learned since that the people who know least as critics are composers.
They're apt to be very prejudiced indeed. Well, gentlemen, while you're confessing and re-examining, here's a question from Carl Schleicher of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. He wants to know whether you have ever passed a severely negative judgment on a work, only to find that your judgment was contradicted in later years by public enthusiasm for the work. Mr. Goldberg.
Yes, I can think of one case, but it wasn't contradicted in later years. It's been contradicted immediately. The case would be Orff's Carmina Burana, which I think is a bunch of claptrap, but whether it's given as a staged work or as an oratorio, the public seems to devour it with enthusiasm.
In other words, your opinion's been contradicted, but you think that you still feel you're right.
Hold to my opinion.
Sticking to your guns, Mr. Frankenstein.
In the case of the same work, I contradicted my own opinion within a very short time. This is, in a sense, even more embarrassing. I was bowled over by Carmina Burana the first time I heard it, and the second time I heard it, I fully agreed with Mr. Goldberg's opinion.
But I think that's a very frank and very laudable thing, and I wish that more people felt free to contradict themselves. Mr. Kolodin.
Well, I was thinking of a work like Strauss's Arabella, which the first time I heard it sounded like nothing more than a rewrite of Rosenkavalier.
Yeah.
But after I heard it second and third time, I began to see the many different ways in which it went off in other directions. And the superficial resemblances began to disappear.
And you
they
decided
don't bother me at all anymore. I mean, I see it quite in a different light.
And now you like it much
Very
better.
much so, yes.
I'll have to come and take some lessons from you, because I had the same impression as your first one, and I haven't changed yet. Now, here's a question from Miss Dorothy Bacigalupo of Bronx, New York. She wants to know if you four gentlemen can agree on the three most important qualifications a professional opera critic should have in order to be a really good critic. The three most important. There are dozens of qualifications he should have, but what would you rank as the three leading qualifications a critic should have? Mr. Harrison.
Well, I think the obvious ones are, number one, a knowledge of the human voice and how it works. Then a very complete knowledge of the score, in which I can include libretto. But a third, and I don't know if my colleagues will agree, but I think is terribly important, is a real sense of the theater. Almost an intuitive one, because I have never been able to divorce opera from theater. It makes no sense to me in any other terms. And I think the development of that sense is crucial if you really get out there and someone sings at you and you're not gripped in the theatrical sense, what's it all about?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is just my opinion.
Well, that's three. That's knowledge of the voice, of the orchestra, and of the theater. Mr. Frankenstein.
An old friend of mine used to say that no one should be a music critic or attempt to write a single review. He was talking about concerts, but it applies to opera. No one should attempt to write a review of concerts until he's heard at least 1,000 concerts. In other words, a rather general experience, extensive experience. After all, what we're doing in writing reviews of operas, whether we know it or not, is comparing. And there must be some considerable background. I think also I would add that one should have some actual experience of music making, no matter what kind of music making it may be. It should be music making under professional conditions. Whether it be, as in my case and as in Al Goldberg's case, experience of the orchestra or of the voice.
I think we'd all agree with you. Here we already have 5 qualities, and I must say I think one very important one is a passionate involvement in the subject. I don't think any critic who doesn't get very excited and head up is worth his salt.
Certainly.
And Mr. Kolodin, you have some...
Well, I was going to add, insofar as opera in particular is concerned, that enthusiasm and curiosity are highly desirable, because there are many good music critics who don't particularly care for opera, and they see as much of it as they have to in the run of their work, and they elect preferences and they ignore other things, and it closes off a wide area of experience, which I think is very necessary.
That's certainly true. Well, can we agree on 3 out of all these? I think we have 6 now. Mr. Goldberg, do you want to...
I think that essentially the qualifications for an opera critic are those same as for a music critic. But I would agree with Mr. Harrison that you have to have a sense of theater and love for the theater. And I agree with Mr. Kolodin. There is a surprising number of musicians who have no interest in opera.
Yeah.
And I think either critics with that disposition aren't much service to opera.
Mr. Harrison?
There's one I think I'd even exchange for one of the 3, which I think is the most important, is the ability to communicate that enthusiasm that you mentioned.
Yes.
Because if you're the most responsive person in the world and you go back and write an ABC review that doesn't burn up the paper, then you've lost your audience, and what good's it?
What good is all your enthusiasm? Well, I don't believe we're going to get together on 3 single, limit it to 3. So let's go on to a question from Mrs. Gary Krause of Cleveland, Ohio. She wants you to comment on something that she calls an astounding statement by Joseph Kerman in his book, Opera as Drama. And this is the statement which she quotes, and I'll read to you. That works like Turandot and Salome will fade from the operatic scene as decisively as have L'Africaine and Lucrezia Borgia is scarcely to be doubted. At present, they do a disservice by obscuring the true works of the operatic tradition, but of course the true works cannot be actually heard. And that's so far Mr. Kerman. Now, what is your opinion of this statement, gentlemen? Mr. Rosenberg?
Well, first of all, it would depend on what he means by the true works of the operatic tradition.
Well, I think he means the works that we would all recognize as absolutely top-flight masterpieces. Mr. Kolodin.
Well, the title of that book is what, again?
Opera and Drama. Opera as Drama, excuse me.
That's an important clue to the whole thing, namely that the view there is of opera that exists in abstraction, that is, as something on paper, something that you can study and read and admire as an entity, whereas the works of the character Turandot and Salome have to be performed. I mean, the performer is the vital element in that context.
Yes, he certainly is. Well, I wish we had time to go on this, because I think that there'd be a lot to be said on many sides of the question. But The chimes you recognize, gentlemen, and sorry as I am to stop our conversation, that's our signal from backstage that the third act of Siegfried is very nearly ready to start. So thank you very much, Albert Goldberg, Irving Kolodin, Alfred Frankenstein, and Jay Harrison. You've upheld the honor of the profession beautifully. This is Edward Downs inviting you to be with us again next week for another session of Texaco's Opera Quiz during the second intermission of Puccini's La Bohème.